Hey everyone, well, don't you love it when you totally mess something up, see it in hindsight, and then feel like a massive moron? Because, well, that's how we're feeling in the office today after our Warlock video. And, I mean, yeah, look, we got a bit blinded by how I think we like certain things that are in some ways the core of a Warlock, but we didn't put enough of the video's runtime into the pain points of the specs that we did cover, and then there was just some issues that we didn't really cover thoroughly. Now that video is unlisted right now because it's not up to snuff, and there's a survey down below for Warlock mains to give your, basically your top 3 pain points for each spec, and we'll be sending that off to Blizz. Now, it's also, I think, revealed a bit of a severe thing with how WoW is designed, because in Torghast, we were loving Warlock, just, doing content in the Warlock, messing about the place with its specs. That was so enjoyable, right? And perspective-wise, also, I mean, we are primarily raid-focused in our personal experiences, so Mythic Plus was also quite a large blind spot for that Warlock video, and I think it's a bit of a blind spot that reveals a design challenge that WoW has. You see, for us, Warlocks being a bit more turrety and needing their Fell Hunter to interrupt, they just felt like reasonable quirks considering the other strengths of the classes, and in a raiding context, those are things that are sort of easy to get around, but in Mythic Plus, no! Mythic Plus is designed in a way that heavily favors on-demand AoE, on-demand burst damage, and lots of movement. And it turns out, right, big fucking surprise, being a turrety class with 2 specs that have got pretty significant ramp-up time, that's a bit of a problem when you could just roll an outlaw rogue or a demon hunter, right? And it turns out that, yes, feeling weak as hell outside of your big 3-minute cooldown, looking at you, Destruction, will feel pretty bad in time trial content. Now, none of these things were an issue for us playing Torghast at our own pace on Alpha, or, just having a blast doing that. But in the real world, these are very real issues that are felt by Warlocks that we did not properly talk about. Now, the design problem for Blizz here is really hard. They've designed the core of WoW Dungeons to be a time trial. Now, if something's a time trial, that inherently favors certain types of class design, and, they want to push keys that will cause people to double down on the classes that are best fit for time trials. Players will want lots of utility because that's how Blizzard have designed the game. So, that Fell Hunter interrupt is not going to feel great. It does sort of push for homogenization of class capability as well. I think that's what Mythic Plus kind of does. So, I mean, yeah, because of that, Warlocks won't feel great in Mythic Plus or Horrific Visions. Raiding can be a different story, and that is the perspective that I think we, by default, had most in mind when we were writing, but that's clearly not good enough. We didn't do a good enough job. I mean, we just did drop the ball. Like, take the Hunter. That was a very critical video. I mean, I'd say that maybe barring the Shamans, we've been one of the more critical outlets when it comes to the classes this time around. Generally, we've been saying they could have done so much more, not enough was done. But for some reason, that just didn't get into this script. And I think it's entirely because we just autopiloted it. That's the best I can come up with. Our heads were we just weren't in the game, right? It was a subpar job. Now, I will say this, I do think that the Affliction Warlock changes are awesome, and I still actually do stand behind what we said about Destro and Demo, but what we said was not complete, obviously. We focused on what we liked, and we didn't spend nearly enough time talking about the problems. And the thing is that what we talked about, what we liked, that is what a Warlock is, right? Those are the things that we liked, and they're the reasons why people actually play a Warlock. But just doing that doesn't then cover the issues that those people who do main Warlocks have in general, in real-world situations. I mean, sure, we mentioned, we said a bunch of talent should be baselined, and the losing Azerite traits kind of stung, but we didn't actually spend nearly enough time in the video going into why we felt that, the detail there, the real-world implications, and that's really the problem with that video. The whole point of us doing these videos at a slower pace is that we get more time to talk about talents and to talk about design, that we actually get to do more research, and that we make the class videos with more educational value because they can be more in depth. But with Warlock, we obviously only did half our job. We did maybe even less. So we're doing it again. That's what this video is going to be. You are going to see all 3 specs covered in a way that I think is still, look, the things that we like, we still do like from the last video, but there's a lot of other things that, yeah, were totally in our blind spot, or, that we just autopiloted through and didn't actually consider. So we are going to be talking about those as well today. And, yeah, that's basically it. I guess all I can say is sorry, definitely, I think definitely having a script and then maybe sleeping on it for a day and coming back with fresh eyes is the thing to do. And certainly with the Warlock, that's not something that happens. So there's definitely takeaways for us as a team. And yeah, the most I can say is thank you for your feedback. And yeah, let's get into the video. Okay, time for take 2 of the Warlocks. Yes, this one is going to be a fair bit more beefy. As an added pain point then, like with the Hunters, the pet summon cast is up to 6 seconds. That is going to feel awful when your pet dies, and that does happen a lot in, say, PvP, and also whenever your pet is just a little bit weak. Now, maybe this is a nerf that's intended to make, say, targeting pets in PvP a bit more rewarding, and maybe to weaken the huge advantage that pets have, pet classes have when they're soloing, but it definitely does feel terrible, yes. Now, this is especially obvious in, say, Torghast. On any Warlock spec, it was way easier to progress solo than with any other classes because of, like, the Voidwalker. Now, in that specifically, even with the 6-second cast time to get your pet back, it didn't really hurt that much when you had Shadow Fury and Fear to keep the mobs at bay, but yes, fundamentally, that 6-second cast does feel significantly worse, especially if, you know, you're just out in the world or you're under duress and you've just got to do that 6-second hard cast. It's another one of those decisions that makes complete sense on paper for balance, but then the implications on the player experience may just be too bad for it actually to be worth the balance, if you get what I mean. There have been people saying that even the Voidwalker has felt notably squishy, which isn't really something I felt while playing unless pulling massive mob packs. Still, like, I would say that Warlock is one of the most satisfying classes to play in Torghast so far, and much of that's just because of how many options that you've got. Of course, the only thing that's missing is a super reliable interrupt, you know, the game's core mechanic of interrupting priority casts. That can get a little bit rough when you're, you know, running Torghast and you don't have a Fell Hunter on you. And this is where we get into a discussion of the fundamental issues with World of Warcraft. If the vast majority of danger comes from interruptible spellcasts, then every spec, right, is going to need an interrupt in order to handle that. Not having an interrupt is going to make life miserable, and even when you're picking the Fell Hunter, it has travel time that makes it feel unreliable, unless, you know, Grimoire of Sacrifice is taken, making, you know, a talent and a demon selection sort of close to mandatory, right? And that's a problem for everyone, but there's then the small matter of, say, Demonology being tied to the Felguard for damage, which does make, you know, choosing a proper interrupt a DPS loss, which really sucks for them. So overall, I would say this. Warlocks are sometimes in a good spot, right, in terms of their overall gameplay, but there definitely are issues, right? There are a lot of issues in their cores that are sort of raised by the loss of Azerite traits and patch 8.2's essences. So overall, when you look at this, I think it's sometimes the case that Warlocks themselves are in a decent enough spot, but then if you actually put those Warlocks in the video game they're literally going to be playing in, say, a Mythic Plus situation, which is a time trial, then yeah, it does feel like it's in a less good spot. There's then also a lot of issues in their cores raised by the loss of Azerite traits and the essences, you know, and then of course there's mostly like just having a bunch of haste and extra resources that you won't have when you start off fresh, and you know, that just level of haste you get through an expansion really does help flow, and that's something you're not going to have at the start of this expansion. So for players who are coming out of patch 8.3, yeah, Shadowlands is going to sting for at least a few weeks until that borrowed power starts to kick in. But to really get to the meat of this stuff, we're going to have to go for the individual specs. Now, there's one bit of this video that's unchanged essentially from the original, and that is Affliction, because I do really feel that Affliction is great. However, Demonology and Destro, well, there's a lot to talk about there, so we're going to prioritize them first in this video. Demonology has received almost no changes. Now, the fantasy of summoning a horde of demons is still pretty good, and it does have a nice rhythm when it gets going, but the complete lack of interaction between those demons just sometimes feels boring. The only major interaction between the demons is demonic consumption, that's a talent, and even then, it's just adding power to an already strong cooldown window. Nothing else that happens can really be played around, especially with the loss of Azerite traits. And while they weren't overly exciting, at least Shadow's Bite and Explosive Potential gave people something to play with, and then Baleful Invocation gave access to more resources when they were needed most. Basically, despite not being very different at their core, they've actually lost a lot of what did make them feel better. Then the amount of haste generated by Explosive Potential, basically, I mean, that's something that made the spec for many players, so obviously we're going to run into issues when we look at the baseline of this class without a new set of borrowed power. Now, this haste also masked, I'd say, a pretty major problem for Demo, and that is feeling like a turret. Most of their abilities are hard casts. Any instant casts that they have are proc-based, so they can't deal damage on the move reliably. Now, this would be fine if being a turret actually conferred advantages to them, right? Most range specs have instant dots to reapply, or at least single spells they can use to reposition. Warlocks were historically designed to be a bit more tanky so they wouldn't have to move as much, but with most mechanics and raids in Mythic Plus being extremely punishing, well, that's no longer really an option. I think Blizzard should really consider giving Demonic Circle or Gateway the effect from Shimmer, so off GCD without interrupting casting, as well as giving them just a bit more freedom. That, or maybe just giving Warlocks more of a reward in return for not moving, and I mean, yes, that would mean, for me, maybe more damage or more utility, something to actually make that trade-off worth it. I think right now, because they're not doing significantly more DPS in return for being a turret and maybe planning about, how you actually play well as a turret, because they don't get that much in return for that trade-off, it just doesn't really feel like it's worth it. Therefore, it just feels like an arbitrarily weak part of the class. Then also there is Pet AI, which, I mean, hey, I mained a hunter since Wrath, so I get it. Pet AI can be a pain in the ass, and that is, something that's going to impact Demonology a decent bit. Now, I've not experienced any major issues on live or alpha recently, but I mean, there are voices out there explaining how it's just not reliable, right? And if I think about playing a Demon Hunter, do I get Fel Rush disconnects that often? No, I don't think I've had it happen in a year, but it still is something people are very commonly complaining about, so yeah, it clearly is an issue that does actually happen to the player base. Now, say a Demon taking a bit longer than it should to get to a target, that is a DPS loss for Demo that's just out of the player's control. It's also pretty rare that a spec's DPS can just be killed. So yeah, I mean, there's no real upside to summoning in, right, a demon that's then going to do the damage versus just casting some damage and throwing it at the enemy. There's even a minor thing I've seen talked about, and that is Wild Imp Stagger Summoning. So like Vengeance Demon Hunter Soul Frags, they act as a resource, but they don't become available immediately. If you press Hand of Gul'dan and then start casting Demonic Tyrant or you hit Implosion, there's actually a decent chance that not all of your imps will have properly spawned yet. Which, I mean, yeah, that's obviously quite an issue. Then also, let's just move on to the introduction of curses that kind of makes this spec a little bit weaker by comparison. This is something we flagged up in the original version of this video, and yeah, it's this thing where their talent Doom, right, because Curse of Doom is now a thing you just have, that's replaced with improved Curse of Doom. Now, the curse does extra damage in less time, and it automatically enslaves any Doom guards spawned. Now, that means that taking the talent will make casting Doom more important to the core rotation, making then the other curses feel worse to use by comparison. Then there's also the issue of just being tied to your Felguard for damage, right? You're forced to use this single pet if you want to do good DPS, and that is a big problem when, well, the utility of your pets varies, like, say, not having a Fel Hunter for that interrupt. I did see some players just float the idea of maybe having a lesser call Fel Hunter, just the idea that you could basically just have an interrupt for them, right, that would not involve your current main active pet. Maybe that is the sort of thing that just would be a pragmatic thing for Blizzard to implement. So anyway, there's that. But there's also a massive elephant in the room, and this is something that I think I just took the base situation as granted, as gospel, when maybe I shouldn't have, because there is the element in the room, the elephant even, with Demonology, right? And that is that many Demo locks were just done dirty by the Legion revamp. Okay, while playing a summoner is a cool class fantasy, it's clear that summoning a bunch of AI demons just does not work the same in World of Warcraft as it does in maybe an action RPG game like Diablo. And a lot of people, they liked being able to use Metamorphosis as a Demonology Warlock and do that. But of course, where did Meta go? Meta went back to the Demon Hunter. And that really just is a problem. Now, I actually do think that Blizzard could probably work out how to just throw players a bone here. Why could we not have a Metamorphosis that is for the Demonology Warlock that, makes them a different type of demon, right? sure, the demon hunters right now, they are melee demons whenever they're using meta. Well, maybe there could be some sort of range demon that the Demonology Warlock could transform into. Maybe there could be a way for Blizzard to sort of meet those players who are unhappy about losing meta, just sort of meet them at the middle. That could actually be possible, and maybe there would be a lot of really cool stuff to gain in terms of the actual fantasy of Demonology if Blizzard were able to execute on that. But anyway, wrapping this one up, given how little Demonology is played, and I saw some people push back to this in the previous video, but look, just, look at Parses from Nihilotha as an example. It's not a massively played spec, but yes, given its issues, it may indeed need a lot of love. I think it's got an awesome fantasy. I think it's got some really incredible spell effects. It's just so satisfying to watch it unfold. But it could just do with your usability improvements, right? And a lot of talent rebalancing. I think maybe this is a spec that is excellently designed on its own, but struggles to mesh with the rest of World of Warcraft. I know I enjoy playing it, but there's just something about the other two specs that feels more viable in day-to-day situations. And I think this actually leads back to what I said at the top of this video, the inherent problem of time trial game design. Mythic Plus is balanced by being a time trial. Horrific Visions are balanced by being a time trial, but being a pet class that has got a decently significant ramp-up time and also turrets about the place, that is just not really something that meshes with that time trial style gameplay. And I think that is something that in this current version of Demonology is always going to be an issue for Blizzard. Now, maybe, oh dear, was it Kil'jaeden's Cunning way back in Mists of Pandaria that just, was the cast while moving thing? But, maybe it actually is just that Blizzard needs some sort of cast while moving situation that is a bit more robust for Demonology, just for the Warlocks in general. Of course, Affliction doesn't have that issue because it does have a lot of dots and instance, but maybe for Demo and Destro, something like that would be an okay decision. But anyway, that is Demonology covered. Let's move on to Destruction. For Destruction, it is a similar story. Fundamentally, nothing has really improved that much. Destro was dominant at the end of Battle for Azeroth because of borrowed power just scaling out of control. There was also the nerfs to Affliction and Demonology that happened throughout the expansion, and then just Destro's ability to do huge on-demand damage on a single target and be able to do priority cleave. And none of that stuff has really changed. And I do think that this class, at least in single target, does have, it's got most fundamentals right. I think it just does, yes, when you sort of are a bit more look at it closely, I guess, it just does face some substantial issues relating to the Infernal and its AoE capability. Okay, so let's get on to the AoE, where basically they do have, in mass AoE, this sort of limited capability. So you got Fire and Brimstone, right? There's that, which is overall a weak enough buff, but, I always did enjoy the pace because of the, the enhanced generation you got from it, but still, it's not really ideal. And if you actually look at that talent row, okay, you've got what? AoE that gives you more sustained shards, or your AoE spender doing more damage, or just you getting regular burst AoE with Cataclysm. And I think the thing is that if all three of those things were things that Destruction could do, then they would start to feel like a more competent, well-rounded spec when it comes to that mass AoE. But right now, I think it just feels like, because they can only pick one, they do have this fundamentally weaker mass AoE. Now, if this is intended to be the sacrifice that the Destro Warlocks have got to make in return for them being very strong single target and very strong in two-target cleave, then it does just have this issue where this spec is a little bit useless in an entire class of content, Mythic Plus. And of course, that was the blind spot of our original video. Yeah, in Mythic Plus, this stuff ain't feeling great. On paper, classes and specs having defined strengths and weaknesses in different, just sort of different damage profiles, right? That can make for a compelling choice, but in reality, that does sort of result in people feeling totally stuck with just what works. More or less, kind of like an extension of the current Covenant debate in a way. Destruction feeling weak or boring in AoE situations means people aren't going to take it in for Mythic Plus keys, which then means that people will develop that whole, this class is bad for this idea. And in a case like this, there's a justification to that. We then have the very real experience problem of certain classes and specs just not being accepted for an entire pillar of endgame gameplay. And I think that does just come back to this theme that I've brought up in this video of, yeah, if you've got this gotta go fast time trial style content, it's going to prioritize certain types of toolkits, and yes, the Warlocks are running into an issue where it doesn't exactly fit them that well. Now, even if AoE was fixed, there still is a large enough issue.
It's not that apparent in general gameplay, but their damage curve is, when you actually look into things a bit deeper, as we now have, it is off. Destro is just too reliant on the infernal supremacy damage window. Now, this is a pretty fundamental issue of how damage output is designed and understood in the game, and it's exacerbated by long cooldowns and ramping mechanics. So Summon Infernal, that's a 3-minute cooldown, which is longer than the average sort of 1 to 2 minute cooldown of other specs. So as a result, to actually be balanced by being a longer cooldown, it has got to do a lot of damage. But that, in turn, makes the damage during that very short window be way bigger than anything done outside of that damage window. And that just sort of leads to problems where you feel pretty bad outside of that damage window. It also ramps then, so it's not even a great immediate feeling. For 30 seconds every 3 minutes, you get to start ramping up. It's not quite as invasive, but I suppose there are some sort of like parallels to the Shadow Priest in a way, right? They only get to feel like they're properly playing the game at the end of their big ramp up during their insanity. With Destro, that lasts for what, about 10 seconds every 3 minutes. And I think that is a very valid gameplay complaint that loads of experienced Destro Warlocks have brought up. It's something we didn't properly cover in the last video, and I think it really is something that does bear mentioning here. Now, the thing is that if that super powerful 10 seconds out of every 3 minutes happens to coincide with some unexpected movement or a distraction or, some sort of issue, maybe a lag spike, then you suddenly, have a very big problem. Now, Vision of Perfection helped how this felt a bit in patch 8.3. So it just means that as you move into Shadowlands without that, it feels worse. Balancing out their damage curve so that the regular rotation didn't feel like a wet noodle in comparison would probably improve this greatly. As would say a way to deal with Chaos Bolt cast being interrupted by mechanics in those important situations like that, last 10 seconds of your ramp. So there's that. But then there's another significant thing here, and I think it's just that the talent should probably be rebalanced, and I think stuff should be baselined. The huge slow casts do make the extra speed from flashover and reverse entropy just feel too good, right? Like essential. Then Grimoire as Supremacy, as we said last time, that should just be rolled baseline. I think that having a class's cooldown window actually result in a change of gameplay a bit more. That should be mandatory, and Infernal without this talent is just kinda boring. Fitting as many Chaos Bolts into a Supremacy window just feels really good, and getting those last few massive casts double with Havoc, that's a really cool high point. But that said, there could be a counterpoint to this, which is that maybe doubling down on the power of that cooldown is what just gives the Warlock this problem where it's got the ramping damage within its main cooldown, which is on a 3-minute CD, which then means that, they feel kind of weak outside of that. And maybe it's a case where, all 3 specs sort of having some sort of ramping up damage. Maybe that should be less of the case. I think that might make a few of the Warlocks a bit more happy. Just an idea. Anyway, overall, managing, say, Conflagration charges for Backdraft, keeping up Immolates, and making proper use of Havoc, I think that does make for a really good gameplay experience, but it might be doing with, just a little bit more, right? Maybe a bit more would actually make that better. In fact, Destro is another example of where talents, I think, sometimes hold the game back, and there's been so many times where we've actually basically wanted to make a video on this topic, but I'll do a very short version here. Having a system that enforces choosing 1 of 3 over 7 talent rows basically means there are 14 things you don't get to pick, like Eradication, Shadow Burn, and Soul Conduit. Now, having those with Flashover, Reverse Entropy, and Dark Soul would definitely make the spec more interesting, but then, is that too much? I mean, maybe it might be. When most of those things are explicitly designed, though, to improve the spec or to be fun to play with, then by having the talent system be what it is, there's kind of by default, at least if you've got lots of really strong talent options, there's just going to be a whole bunch of missed opportunity. Now, the idea of customizing a combat build, that is very rarely realized in the game, I would say, and most of the Warlock class is an example of that. So maybe talents as an entire system should be rethought, and maybe if that was to happen, Destro would be one of the larger beneficiaries. That's probably an idea we can talk about more in the future, though. But if I was wrapping up Destro, I would say, look, I think it's got a really strong core, really strong fantasy, but it does have some core usability issues relating to how it actually just, say, meshes in Mythic Plus scenarios and things like that. So overall, I think Blizz should probably baseline a few things. They should probably think about the movement options for Warlocks as well, and maybe some sort of solution to not make them feel like they are totally tied to a 3-minute cooldown. So there you go. That is Destro. Next, let's move on to the one that I think is just really, really, really good, and that is the Affliction Warlock. The only spec with a significant change is Affliction. Basically, Unstable Affliction no longer costs soul shards, but it's got a total limit of 1. That is very different to the older design, so there's that going on. Then, their new spell and their core soul shard spender is Malefic Rapture. Now, it does shadow damage to all targets afflicted by your damage over times, and it actually increases per active dot that you've got. Now, this, at least in theory, does fix a fairly significant issue that Affliction had during BFA, that it had this really long ramp-up time that didn't really go anywhere. Now, it still does require 2, maybe 3 dots being applied to targets before the spending phase begins, but it does feel really good to actually blow up your targets there. So that new core system, I think, is working pretty well. Basically, first you're going to start up with your setup. So you're going to be dropping a Seed of Corruption into a large pack. You're then going to, tab across some agonies onto your targets, and then you're going to select your priority target and then put an Unstable Affliction on them. So that's your setup. But then, of course, the payoff of extending all of that with Dark Glare and then maybe casting 4 or 5 Malefic Raptures, that feels really good. It feels awesome. Their AoE capabilities through all this are going to be nigh unmatched, super strong, and that's especially with Sow the Seeds actually returning to its Legion form and throwing 3 seeds out instead of 2. So that's all pretty sweet, actually. Now, there are a few strange things, like Haunt still exists as a talent, but that's in a world where Unstable Affliction is also a single target 10% damage increase, so that's a bit weird. Now, actually playing with it doesn't feel bad, but it just is a bit weird, I suppose, having 2 spells that feel like they've got a little bit of an overlap in what they actually do. So that is a bit odd, but I mean, it does actually still work in gameplay. There's then also the apparent lack of a single target, totally focused spender, because Malefic Rapture, that actually scales up with the amount of damage over time spells that you've got applied. So it does feel a little bit wasted on a single target situation. So it's weird, overall, they've got these 2 soul shard spenders that feel AoE focused in design, right? So that does feel a bit half-baked and weird. Maybe, right, another single target interaction or 2 would be nice with this spec. So that's a bit weird for single target, but certainly it does mean when you're in an AoE situation and you're an Affliction Warlock, you're going to just feel like an absolute king, spreading all these diseases everywhere. It is going to feel great. Maybe in terms of fixing this problem, Malefic Rapture could do something with your current Unstable Affliction target. Maybe that would be a way of, the Unstable Affliction, which is going to be on your priority target, kind of indicating your single target situation. So maybe there could be some gameplay there. Now, there's also the issue of Malefic Rapture scaling with the number of dots. That actually is quite tricky because depending on the tuning, that could make Siphon Life, one of your talents, a necessary pick because, of course, having an extra dot available, that's going to increase the Malefic Rapture damage by between 33 and 50%, so that is fairly major. So yes, we're in this situation where it is immensely satisfying, this core apply your dots and blow them up. That feels so good. On single target though, it is currently, I'll admit, a little bit boring because, well, spinning plates doesn't really feel that difficult when it's just one target and when the pandemic window allows for really easy refreshes. Losing the pandemic invocation trait that sort of incentivized refreshing closer to a dot's expire, that's going to sting a little bit for keeping that gameplay actually being fun. Now, it might be worth just considering some sort of maybe a snapshotting mechanic for Affliction to make their single target a bit more exciting, or maybe returning a Malefic Grasp in some form, maybe allowing players to amplify dots where they can, and maybe that working more for a single target situation, right? There could be some more there to spice up the single target. But overall, I will say this. I think Affliction has got a positive change and is moving in a good direction. Yes, though it could use a little bit more single target excitement. Keeping 3 dots up just isn't that satisfying. There are maybe some other smaller problems, though, that are still left in the spec, like Drain Soul is usually a mandatory pick because of its ease of use and increased damage over Shadow Bolt. Then Death Bolt, that's way more interesting. it's so cool. I love that talent, but I think it needs to be a bit stronger to be a bit more viable. I think doing something with these on single target would actually be nice for the gameplay of this spec. Maybe it's worth considering them just baselining Deathbolt and having it cost some shards. Anyway, despite this, I'll say this to end off this section. Affliction Warlock is one of the most positive experiences on Alpha so far. I really, really like the direction that it's moved in. So overall, I think the Warlock specs are not bad by any means. I think they basically are fun to play, but that they have a lot of issues in certain parts of World of Warcraft's content. There is tons of great feedback on how they could be improved out there. Hopefully the survey in this video will add to that body of feedback. I think Blizzard should be paying attention to the best stuff there. Clearly, there is enough being said in the Warlock community that there is probably more for Blizzard to actually look at here. Generally, if you liked the Warlock in BFA, you will like it in Shadowlands, but only really once all of your borrowed power returns. Until then, yeah, it might be a little bit painful. I think facing the future and what Blizzard could do, I'd be perhaps worried that Demonology does not have enough positive aspects to it to outweigh its quirks, despite how much potential it does have with some design iteration. Then for Affliction, I think, yeah, maybe a few little tweaks and fixes would be awesome, but fundamentally it's really quite a good spec, I think. Then for Destruction, I think it needs a few passes, but could be really good if, the feeling of playing it moment to moment actually match the damage meters, instead of, the severe mass AoE weakness that they've got, and the over-reliance on the Infernal window. So, there is a fair amount to change here. I think in our previous video, we just talked about how we kind of like the core of each spec. We think they're cool, but really our blind spot, I think the largest one was Mythic Plus. I think that much is obvious, and just some aspects of their damage profile. Generally, I think more things being baseline so that these guys have just got more meat on their bones in general. I think those talent problems are definitely quite an issue, especially on Destro. So there's a lot for Blizz to look at, but to be honest with you, I think that they still do have good solid cores to them, and that does mean that one or two baseline additions could actually go a long way to solving some of the issues that the Warlock community is facing here, bar, say, the example of the Demonology Warlocks who, many of whom, they want meta back. It really is just that simple. They want meta back. So maybe that is something the Blizzard could work into that spec in the future, actually making a ranged metamorphosis, right? Trying to see what that design would be. I think that would be fine. I actually don't think it would eat up the space currently filled by the Demon Hunters, because, it would have different art, it would have different gameplay. So yeah, I think that's the main concerns. What I'll say though to end this is thank you very much for your feedback. Hopefully you feel like we've taken it on board, we've listened, we've done more research, we've learned. I definitely feel like we have learned, and I think that this will help us as we're moving into the future and doing more class content. So thank you for everything. I hope you found this video to be interesting and educational. Let me know if you've got any more thoughts. Be sure to check out that survey as well, so you can get some feedback to Blizz. And yeah, with that, thank you, and I'll see you next time.